Thank you very much. Is it popular? I think that it's right to think about large companies like Royal Dutch Shell as you do about society at large. That there's a tension, isn't there, between what it is that we have done in the past and what we may need to do in the future. And one of my roles is to help us make our own change as we take part in this large journey. So it's a privilege to be here today. And there were 2 or 3 themes I think that came out of the earlier presentations that I wanted to try and link back into some things which are about one of the themes that's emerged today, which is it takes about 40 years to change large chunks of the energy system. And the target we have leaves us about 40 years to make the change in. So this means there's a huge premium on doing the things we can do already and doing them well. It puts a huge premium on efficiency, that's clear. Although I think we've also heard that getting folks to do efficiency is a lot harder than it seems, which will bring us, I think, to the first piece of this story, which is the behavioural piece. I quite liked the trust, information, governance and participation storyline, which I suspected was relevant to rather more than the climate piece, or indeed energy, but perhaps to society at large. I also liked the emphasis on what I was described in the written paper as instruments for research development and then crucially demonstration. I want to distinguish in what I talk about between R&D and demonstration, because demonstration is part of what the Commissioner asked for. It's show me one. Show me one that I can adopt in due course. And the third thing is about the role of positive reinforcement in getting folk to do stuff, as opposed to the process of punishing them for perceived or perhaps actual misdemeanors. So technology, absolutely, and then behaviour. How do you draw those 2 things together? Because you need public trust and support. And I think one of the points about demonstration is that it validates technology, it's designed to reduce cost, and it should be targeted at creating public acceptance and trust. And too often that's not included in the way in which that activity takes place. So we know if there are 9 billion people and we want to drive welfare, and it needs to be accessible, affordable and acceptable in order to achieve all of that, we're going to have twice the energy that we have today. And that means, and this is a crucial point, we shall have to have all of the energy systems that we can imagine using. This is a real and story. There isn't a real process of deciding not to do this and do that instead. We need to grow renewables to about the same size as the current oil and gas industry. It is highly unlikely that the oil and gas industry could grow to meet that demand, even if there were no other constraints over that period. And we're going to need the nuclear and the efficiency. And that means we're going to need things like CO2 capture and storage in order to square the circle, with the huge requirement to also reduce the emissions. How do we put that story together? So what can the EU do to maintain momentum in this piece? So I heard a conversation around the move to the 30% target, and I heard that industry was positioned as resisting this because we are fearful about its outcome. So let me say, I just think it's a bad idea. And you can set huge and demanding targets if you like, but my experience is they do not create innovation. What they do is they lock in the deployment of the past for one reason or another. So I think we also need some certainty. And I think that there are 2 or 3 ways in which we could resolve this kind of storyline. So the first of those is to recognise that the robustness of the current CO2 price signal is below where we want it to be. And we have the story about Goldilocks, don't we? It's got to be not too hot, not too cold, not too fast, not too slow. It has to be just right. But in that process, I think that we're drawing some allowances from phase 3 of the system is called for post the recession. That's what I call the reset. The medium-term piece is to set an auction reserve price for phase 4, a clear signal that you intend to have a floor price, which will buy down risk and increase the rewards for those who want to invest. But the ETS is a deployment mechanism. It's not a demonstration or an R&D mechanism. And real innovation comes out of targeted approaches to the process of RD&D. And the Commissioner mentioned the NER 300, which I think is a superb example of how we can bring ourselves together to create this kind of positive outcome in specified areas. Innovative renewables and the CO2 capture and storage storyline coming together with a substantial direction which is consistent with the overall objectives of the European Union. It's important that the technology push policies are separated from the deployment, because you have to make some choices about where you're going to innovate. But you should have technology neutral deployment. And in the end, you should buy it from others if they can do it for less, because that's the value for money story. So one of the things it seems to us that means is that doing the doable means not having deployment policies which discriminate against the various pieces, getting on with what can be done. And so, for example, it won't surprise you, being that I'm an oil and gas guy, I think there's a real role for gas coupled with CO2 capture and storage. It's half the CO2 of coal immediately. It also is affordable and accessible, particularly given the IEA's estimate of some 250 years of reserves. So we can use it for as long as it's reasonable in the context of the emission reductions we require, but only if we do the CO2 capture and storage alongside it. Those two things come together to create a package that pushes the whole port storyline forward. Picking up the storyline about positive reinforcement, it's one of the things that I'd like to see happen in the biomass biofuels area. A lot of conversation around the ILUC story, a lot of conversation around the need for negative emissions in due course. And certainly biofuels in conjunction with CO2 capture and storage, perhaps in co-fired power stations, perhaps at the biofuels facilities themselves, could help with all of that. Currently what we do is we take an approach which punishes people for perceived misdemeanours on indirect land use change. I'd like to see us move towards a process in which we reward the wider agricultural sector, which will be key to delivery of our objectives overall. And now I change a little bit to the international position. So I'm not as concerned as others that we don't have an internationally binding agreement. I think that will come in due course. I'm much more interested in the bottom-up action. I'm really interested in the place I was in earlier this week. I went to California. A lot of stories told about the United States. I don't know if you know, but they just held the world's largest referendum on climate change issues. This is called Proposition 23, which was a process to remove from the California legislation all of their climate change related rules and laws. It was resoundingly defeated. It took more votes than any other part of the ballot, including the ballot for governor and lieutenant governor and the rest of the issues. What it's going to enable is something really interesting. California is going to do a deal with Amazonas in Brazil at the subnational level, unencumbered by the federal government's inability to act, which will encompass everything from RED through cap and trade to a whole offset program and cross-investment. These kinds of things look to me to be really important in driving the change and the difference. And we should legitimize all of that instead of waiting until the other thing gets fixed. If we seek the perfect, it's often the enemy of the good. So focusing on action now is critical, getting it done, because it's the area under the curve that matters, and reducing it now is a much more cost-effective process and higher value for money than waiting for things you may think are better to reduce it later. And finally, I would welcome the opportunity to join a roundtable for energy if the Minister intends to set that up, and would look forward to carrying on these kinds of conversations. So it's time to get on with what needs to be done, and it's time to do the maximum amount that we can without waiting for all of the global agreements, etc., to be in place. Thank you very much.